Hi, good morning, guys. This is Allie McCarran. I'm sorry I'm not there this morning. I'm out of town at a wedding. But luckily, due to the glory of the internet, I should still be able to give my presentation without a lot of strife. So hopefully this works and we can get started with it. I decided to do my research on storytelling through pottery, specifically looking at the region of the American Northwest, basically between New Mexico and Arizona, um, and observing American Indian pueblos. So that whole region and then individuals within there will be kind of what we look at in general. And as far as context goes, it'll be in the 20th century. There's a little bit previously, but for the most part, it's in the last 100 to 150 years. So we are looking at fairly frequently made and commonly made work. Of course, part of the aspect of storytelling is that these techniques and ideas have been passed down through generations. Starting with Carolyn Cordero, she was a Coahiti Pueblo Indian living in New Mexico. She was born in 1915 at the Coahiti Pueblo. The pottery climate there during the time was actually in a steady decline, and in general, the pots were fairly stagnant within that pueblo. Um, she lived with her family and worked mostly with beadwork and basketry, but she decided to give pottery another try in the 1950s with her cousin. After her cousin kind of encouraged her, she started to make these sculptures um, of her paternal grandfather. These sculptures depicted him with his eyes closed and his mouth open, and he had all of these little hangers-ons represented as grandchildren, all listening with rapt attention and potentially getting into some trouble depending on the sculpture and the individual. She described these pieces as the grandfather having his eyes closed because he was thinking and his mouth open because he was singing. And I think that that's such a strong um, kind of example of the storytelling aspect of this, that he's pulling from his memory and he's sharing his knowledge and his wisdom with the next generation. And I feel like there is a lot of parallel with that compared to the actual production of pottery in a lot of these pueblos, because for the most part, these production practices are passed down from generation to generation, from grandmother to mother to daughter. So the fact that there are these lines being drawn between the two, where there's this oral tradition and this pride in what these people have to say, it's certainly interesting to see it depicted in the form of a sculpture, especially considering these pieces are fairly unique compared to what we'll look at next with the Pueblo pots. There isn't as much sculpture, at least potentially not as well known, but Cordero kind of started her own movement with these pieces. After a point, there were many more artists creating work such as this and kind of celebrating that. I think something else interesting to mention with these storytellers is that Cordero processed and acquired all of the materials herself. She went to the deposits and took her own clay. She prepared and sculpted and fired work at her residence in the backyard. It really was just something that was close and personal and done in the home with very intimate details and history that really just kind of makes these very special. In looking at the pieces themselves, they are considered to have too many little figures hanging onto the grandparents in order to make it seem kind of excessive and kind of just too many going on, exaggerated, I would say. So I think that that's kind of an interesting look into Cordero's memories, even. This is basically a snapshot of her listening to her grandfather and thinking about how important his words were in the context of the next generation. Overall, I believe that Cordero's work really exemplifies how important verbal storytelling and tradition can be, and I think that it's really a celebration of that in the form of ceramic work. I mean, the pieces really speak for themselves in terms of the expression and kind of the feeling of home that they give. I really feel a connection to them in that they are very relatable. I think that we all have kind of gotten wisdom from our elders in one form or another, and I think that they're just very special pieces of work. So, next, we're going to be looking at Pueblo pots just as a general term. If you look at the map on the right side of this slide, you can kind of get an idea of what we are looking at locationally here. Every red square that you see would be considered a pueblo or a residence, and you can see that they're all very, very close together, but there are some outliers um, that we'll talk about in a little bit. Um, each of these pueblos kind of came up with their own unique style of pottery and style of decoration while keeping similarities across all of them. Most of that kind of depended on proximity and the availability of materials at those specific locations. So on this slide, we have a selection of 6 different pueblos with 6 different styles of pots. Some of them are specific to the pueblo itself, while others are specific imagery that you would commonly see in relation to spiritual belief. So something such as the Ivanyu, it is a water serpent that is depicted fairly frequently. And part of what the purpose of these pots is to portray a spiritual essence or spiritual kind of communication. So there are images of animals and plants and weather and other things that were important to the people at the time. Um, the middle column, the Acoma and the Laguna, actually shared fairly similar aesthetic choices in the form of repeated geometric lines and patterns because they were in very close proximity to each other. They were actually neighbors. So Laguna pottery was considered to be fairly motivated and influenced by the Acoma pottery. But you can see that there are some differences in the form of the red slip. Zia pottery is most well known for the bird form that you see there, and that's another, similar to the Ivanyu, a creature that's associated with certain spiritual beliefs. Zuni pottery is well known for the deer that you see, known as a spirit deer or deer in house motif, kind of representing the spirit within the beast itself. And then finally at the bottom right, the San Ildefonso pots were fairly frequently black on blackware with black burnishing and black slip these pieces were very, very unique in that they had that black clay accessible to them in their area. And that isn't something that was available in every other place. So, something to consider with these pieces across the board would be that they are generally walking to get to these clay deposits. I'm sure that at some point they had transportation, but part of the tradition of making these pots and acquiring these materials was traveling to these deposits and acquiring them and dragging them back to their settlements. Um, so there's a very good reason that you wouldn't see black clay in Zuni because it's so far away from where San Ildefonso is. And that's also why you'll see some more crossover between pueblos that are close to each other. So, in the form of this being important towards storytelling, I would say that these pots are all, in their own unique way, an expression of these pueblos and what they're trying to convey to tourists and to each other. Um, Really, they portray what's important to them and what is kind of revered within their culture and what's aesthetically pleasing. And because of that, each of these pots tells a story, and the repetition of each of these pots could tell a story. Um, and I think that that kind of really helps show why these pots are important and why they are continually revered to this day and in such high demand. I believe also that the production of these pieces is very intimate to the people due to the fact that the design is passed down verbally and the production methods are passed down verbally. You'll notice that all of these pieces are hand built, generally coil built. They use slip and they're burnished to a high shine, and that's fairly universal among all of these Pueblo pieces. There weren't a lot of wheels, and in general, burnishing was the main method of getting these things to be shiny. Um, it's also fairly interesting in that the materials used to actually apply the slips would sometimes be children's hair to get very thin lines. I think that's such an interesting and intimate part of the production of these pieces. There's such a personal touch with all of them, from them being hand built to the very intimate use of basically their bodies in the creation of the decorations. Finally, I want to talk about Doris Pay. She was living in San Ildefonso, Pueblo, and she actually took a break from pottery. She worked with it with her grandmother and her mother, but she decided that she did not want to continue with pottery, and she went to school to be a nurse. She traveled to California and lived there for a time and actually met her future husband, Johnny Gonzalez. Johnny was the son of a well-known potter in the area, and he actually convinced her to move back to the Pueblo. From there, surrounded by other passionate potters, Dora's work kind of resurfaced, and she really sort of caught her stride and started to create some really lovely pieces. Working with her mother-in-law and her husband, she started to produce work again and actually won a blue ribbon for one of her pieces, which kind of prompted her to go into full production in the 60s. So her work is fairly unique in that she added these turquoise chunks to the eyes of the Avanyu serpents. She very commonly used the Avanyu as a imagery technique and had it very frequently on most of her work. You also notice that she had access to both black and red clay. These pots with the turquoise chunk kind of became her signature piece, and she really worked this to be her kind of cornerstone to her entire process. At the same time, she still managed to stay true to the San Ildefonso Pueblo using that black on black ware. She had access to that and she used that. Um, she also continued to mine, process, prepare, and work the clay with her own hands. She was not one to have it brought to her. So, really, the tradition of the potter really stuck with her despite her taking a break and taking a different path. I think that her work is really unique in that she took a step back from the tradition and took a step away from this work, but in talking to her husband and kind of revisiting the tradition of this process, she was pulled back in and became a very prolific potter in this area. Um, I think that her work really kind of shows a modern touch that's unique to her, and that's something that was heavily considered by everybody around her, judging by the reception that she received from the community. In that way, I believe that due to kind of the verbal affirmation that what she was doing was valid and important, she really found her voice again and pulled back into her culture and what was really important and valuable to her. So, kind of in conclusion here, I believe that a lot of the pots that we have seen today kind of really just show a love of culture for these American Indians, and they really are a vocalization tool from the potter to the viewer to just discuss and love the culture that you see. I believe that due to the fact that so many of these processes are passed down verbally, that storytelling in general plays a gigantic role because these people sit and they discuss and they create. It's not really a silent activity by any means, it's rooted in tradition. That's about all I have, though, so I hope that you guys enjoy my presentation and I hope that you have a great day.